I particularly wanted to say that given the most remarkable devoted service to the Queen, to my family, and to the country, and also to the whole of the Commonwealth.
He has offered the most extraordinary, loyal dedication to the sovereign, to my household, to the nation, and likewise to the entire Commonwealth. Throughout its long history, Britain had survived royal departures, internal family treachery, and deep constitutional crises before Babu, yet the public was entirely unready for the declaration emerging from Buckingham Palace. King Charles had reached his ultimate verdict. Archie and Lilibet, grandchildren residing thousands of miles away from the very institution of their birth, were to be excluded from the order of inheritance. This was far from a mere caution, an ongoing negotiation, or a brief intervention. It stood as an irreversible decree whose ripple effects would span across two separate continents. Prior to exploring the true implications of this choice for the royal household, make sure to follow the channel so you never overlook a single development. Seated at his desk, Charles examined the finalized phrasing a second time. This broadcast would officially terminate the constitutional status of Archie and Lilibet within the monarchy. The legal arrangement determining who inherits the crown represented far more than a simple formal role. It embodied royal legacy and the ongoing spirit of the realm. By stripping these two young people of their positions, a connection forged at their birth was severed, an act the king recognized the public would view as far weightier than administrative forms. With an assistant waiting nearby, the monarch kept his hand resting upon the paper. Charles was fully aware that these words would inflict deep pain upon his own child. Even so, he maintained that the lineage of the throne could not endure merely as a hollow right. After reviewing the expression regarding future service to the crown once more, he looked up and gave the order. Release it. The chosen language focused heavily on accountability, laying bare his core conviction that constitutional entitlement must always demand active duty. Upon receiving the communication at his residence, Harry initially assumed a blunder had occurred. His expression shifted drastically as his eyes scanned Archie's name, followed by Lilibet's. Though Meghan inquired about the situation, he simply lowered his mobile device. When she pressed for an answer, she watched his initial disbelief solidify into pure rage as he revealed that both of their children had been stripped of their ranks. This went beyond mere administrative restructuring. It was a definitive sentence passed down upon two innocent lives. Meanwhile, inside a room within the palace, William was confronting the exact same text. Holding an early copy, the future monarch paused momentarily upon encountering Lilibet's name before folding the document away. He inquired whether his brother had been notified of this step. An assistant affirmed that a transmission had indeed been sent, though the prince sensed an underlying coldness beneath the formal reply. A comprehensive constitutional appraisal, an official probe into royal regulations and their impacts, had quietly brought together strategists and authorities behind locked doors. This verdict had been meticulously crafted long before the populace ever learned of its existence. The spotlight now moved away from institutional systems to the actual individuals enduring the consequences throughout the realm. It was a tale of a grandfather prioritizing his institutional obligations versus an estranged son confronting what he saw as a profound betrayal, alongside a mother battling fierce indignation and two infants far too young to grasp what had been erased from their destinies. Beneath the formal legal phrasing lay 4 human lives chained together by lineage, geographic separation, bitterness, and an internal fracture that had failed to heal. In the eyes of the populace, Archie and Lilibet were merely names printed beneath princes and princesses within the inheritance hierarchy. To Harry, however, they were simply his offspring. To Meghan, they embodied a destiny she had sacrificed immensely to shield. And to Charles, they represented grandchildren with whom he shared almost no connection, serving as living symbols of a son who had chosen to walk away. While the declaration bore an institutional shape, its genuine impact struck the heart of a split family where every noble title masked an internal agony. Stepping into the nursery, Harry carried with him a quietness that felt weightier than raw rage. Archie remained completely engrossed in a book, while Lilibet played nearby, both entirely oblivious that individuals across the nation were already dissecting their future prospects. For several long moments, the Duke observed his children in absolute silence. His firstborn had arrived when he and Meghan were still operating within the active tier of the monarchy, meaning they directly represented the throne through public engagements and state service. From the moment of his birth, Archie had inherited a set of obligations tied to the House of Windsor, the historic lineage of the crown. Today, those identical expectations were stripped away before the boy could even comprehend they had ever been established. The situation surrounding Lilibet's standing brought an entirely different layer of sorrow. Having been born following the Sussex departure, her life was entirely removed from palace environments. Even so, her very name tied her explicitly to Queen Elizabeth II, whose intimate childhood moniker held immense sentimental weight within the inner circle. Meghan recognized that bond profoundly, just as she recognized how swiftly royal fondness could be uncoupled from institutional power. Meghan questioned whether Charles had reached out directly prior to the publication of the decree. Shaking his head, Harry confessed that nothing beyond an official transmission had been delivered. Her grief instantly transformed into a rigid resolve. She remarked that the king had treated Archie and Lilibet as mere data points on an administrative register rather than grandchildren possessing real emotions, identities, and futures. He offered no defense for his father's actions. Looking back toward his little ones, he muttered that the most painful reality was knowing they would inevitably discover the exact manner in which this verdict was broadcast to the world. Charles himself had grappled with that identical anxiety. The sovereign had repeatedly cross-examined whether maintaining the infants in the inheritance line would protect familial harmony or instead breed worse bewilderment for two young spirits being reared entirely separate from royal duties. The sequence of inheritance was far from a basic family tree. It functioned as the official legal ranking determining the successor to the crown. In his view, permitting those ranks to stand without a corresponding commitment to duty threatened to turn institutional responsibility into nothing more than empty imagery. The specific role played by William remained obscured from view. Though he was fully aware that the policy review was progressing, no official account clarified whether he championed the removal or merely deferred to his father's supreme authority. Catherine discovered him standing in isolation at Windsor, the printed declaration still gripped in his hand. When she inquired about what weighed most heavily on his mind, the future king replied softly that Archie and Lilibet would one day consume every single word of that text. That specific dread traced back to an earlier, hidden chapter that the household had kept obscured from the spotlight, an intimate event where the reality of two absent infants could no longer be brushed aside. While the definitive proclamation commenced with legal signatures and technical phrases, the true point of no return occurred during a single, highly tense family gathering. Many months before the British public heard the news, a private function inside Windsor Castle laid bare the core paradox of Archie and Lilibet's royal destiny. Their names still occupied spaces on the inheritance list, yet their actual lives were unfolding thousands of miles beyond the jurisdiction of the crown. What had started as a tightly regulated family milestone transformed into the exact moment Charles could no longer evade the ultimate dilemma. Could young children inherit a constitutional status while remaining completely detached from the nation, the duties, and the very establishment supporting it? Charles had dedicated months to evaluating what inheritance should truly represent within a contemporary monarchy. He fully recognized the vast distinction between merely inheriting a place in royal history and being actively prepared to step forward should unprecedented events transform that history into an immediate reality. The order of succession, that legal framework deciding the path to the throne, demands genuine obligation alongside prestigious status. Royal strategists had cautioned him that the status of Archie and Lilibet would grow increasingly indefensible as they matured overseas, entirely cut off from a royal upbringing, public obligations, or direct links to British national identity. The profound stillness manifested during an intimate family gathering, commemorating the anniversary of Queen Elizabeth II's accession, the exact date she officially assumed sovereignty. A formal register of family obligations was recited aloud, detailing the relatives bound to the crown and its destiny. Archie's name was spoken first, with Lilibet's occurring right after. Both infants were missing from the room. Even so, two specific seats had been set aside to recognize them in a purely symbolic gesture. A heavy silence fell as their names echoed through the chamber, and no one uttered a word. The king gazed toward those vacant spots, and the glaring paradox suddenly became agonizingly concrete. Once the gathering concluded, Charles approached a principal advisor, questioning whether the crown was sustaining a legitimate family tie or simply maintaining a hollow mirage on parchment. The strategist's momentary hesitation unnerved him far more than any explicit caution could have. Before departing Windsor, William sought out his father, choosing his expressions with great care to state that the line of inheritance could not remain divorced from active accountability indefinitely. He refrained from demanding the exclusion of the children, nor did he speak of Harry with malice, yet the prince's caution compelled the sovereign to reflect on the dangers of procrastination, looming ambiguity, escalating friction, and two developing youths, saddled with constitutional duties they were never trained to fulfill. Harry subsequently discovered, through a recorded confidential briefing, that his children's non-attendance had been debated immediately following that event. Rage overwhelmed him. He expressed to Meghan that Archie and Lilibet were being penalized for a geographical separation they had no hand in choosing, while she countered that the household was transforming the shortcomings of adults into a weight for innocent children to carry. The following dawn, Charles ordered the creation of a sealed constitutional memorandum, a highly confidential state document analyzing royal prerogatives and their outcomes. Its central inquiry was stark. Should the right to the throne remain automatic when any plausible trajectory toward institutional service had vanished? When Harry uncovered that this formal evaluation had been initiated right after the Windsor incident, he insisted on confronting his father directly, without any intermediaries standing between them. While those vacant chairs at Windsor had ignited the inquiry, it would require a direct clash between father and son to convert internal hesitation into a permanent mandate. When Harry finally stood before Charles, there were no television cameras, no official press statements, and no strategist positioned between them. There was only a father, a son, and a highly polished wooden table, bearing the weight of years of unexpressed resentment. Harry had crossed the ocean to fight for the destiny of Archie and Lilibet, while Charles arrived determined to safeguard the monarchy. Yet beneath every legal point lay a far more agonizing mutual indictment. Each man firmly believed the other had prioritized individual desires over the household they had once vowed to shield. Harry had journeyed back to Britain the moment he discovered that the inheritance evaluation had progressed beyond casual palace chatter. He insisted upon an entirely private audience, flatly rejecting the presence of personal secretaries. This formal inquiry, the authorized process assessing whether Archie and Lilibet should keep their positions in the sequence of inheritance, had already advanced toward its concluding proposal. He was fully aware that once these phrases were codified into law, no amount of public outrage would ever reverse them. Charles entered the room carrying the classified constitutional memorandum, wanting his son to hear the underlying rationale firsthand, though the paperwork in his grip made it obvious how restricted their options had become. Harry demanded to know how the exclusion of two young infants could possibly reinforce a family structure. His father responded that the crown could not pledge institutional positions to individuals being brought up with zero intention of serving the British public or comprehending the obligations bound to the throne. At that moment, Harry's emotional control shattered. He argued that Archie and Lilibet were being penalized simply because he had stepped away from institutional duties, emphasizing that neither infant had a say in the vast distance separating California from Great Britain. Locking eyes with him, Charles insisted that their personal value had never been doubted. The verdict, he clarified, was entirely about the trajectory his son had selected for their upbringing, a life completely detached from the establishment, while simultaneously claiming enduring constitutional privileges within its borders. Thrusting his chair backward, Harry stood up, demanding that Charles address him as a grandfather rather than shielding himself behind the supreme power of a monarch. The sovereign slowly took off his spectacles and set them down next to the memorandum, confessing that his role as their grandfather was the precise reason he had postponed this painful verdict for so long. Each month of internal wrestling had been a genuine effort to discover a middle ground that protected both institutional obligations and family unity. Charles then put forward a solitary concluding option. Archie and Lilibet could preserve a structured tie to Britain through consistent family interactions, shared moments with their grandfather, and a developing comprehension of royal duties. To Harry's ears, this sounded like a demand for control rather than a fair compromise. He charged the palace with attempting to coerce his children through institutional leverage, while the king countered with a stern warning that a family connection could not be maintained solely when noble titles were in jeopardy. The dialogue concluded without any consensus. Harry walked toward the exit, believing the decree could still be contested, but Charles halted him with a final, definitive declaration, stating that rejecting every familial obligation while demanding every constitutional right was a contradiction that could not persist indefinitely. Their private exchange concluded with neither individual backing down And beyond that closed door, the institutional framework designed to alter the succession was already grinding forward. Monarchical power almost never displays itself through raised voices, choosing instead to operate via sealed dossiers, meticulously scheduled consultations, and phrases polished until all human emotion is drained from the text. While Harry resisted the decree with the passion of a father, Charles was compelled to execute his duties as a sovereign. Surrounding him were legal experts, legislators, and the heir to the throne, all fully conscious that erasing two names from the line of inheritance could never be treated as a petty domestic penalty. It had to be presented as an absolute institutional requirement. Although the personal proclamation of Charles formed the core of the announcement, his signature by itself was insufficient to finalize the transformation. Legal strategists immediately began mapping out the parliamentary and judicial trajectory, the structured process through which royal statutes are reviewed, ratified, and formalized by the government. The palace framed this resolution as a foundational tenet. The right to inherit the throne must remain tied to the United Kingdom, public service, and an authentic readiness to serve the monarchy. Lacking that vital link, advisors cautioned, inheritance would degenerate into mere entitlement devoid of accountability. William stepped into the evening briefing, carrying the quiet gravity of someone who had already calculated the true cost. Charles questioned whether the history books would look back on this choice as an act of cruelty. The prince did not give a rushed reply, stating that history would evaluate whether they safeguarded the crown, while remembering that two living children existed beneath every line of legal text. His analysis offered zero consolation, yet the king required that unvarnished truth. Charles conceded that Archie and Lilibet might mature believing their own grandfather had cast them aside, his voice wavering slightly before he regained his composure. The sovereign then appended his signature to the document authorizing the announcement to proceed. For a fleeting second, the pen hovered motionless against the paper, as though he still secretly prayed that hesitation might reveal an alternative route. William scanned the concluding memorandum once more. As the heir apparent, the individual destined to succeed to the throne after the reigning monarch, he bore a solemn obligation to defend the future of the establishment. Yet Harry remained the little brother he had previously shielded, guided, and confided in. The future king was well aware that his silence would be interpreted as full endorsement, even if his name never appeared on any public statement. The ultimate document featured one vital boundary. Archie and Lilibet would keep their family lineage and personal titles for the time being, but they would lose all legal expectations of succeeding to the crown. Charles had explicitly turned down a far more severe proposal that would have stripped away every single royal connection, desiring a clear line between family and state rather than the complete deletion of his two grandchildren. While that distinction appeared balanced within the palace walls, its interpretation would warp within minutes on the outside. The moment the proclamation went public, technical accuracy was swallowed by human fury. Harry would perceive it as a penalty, Meghan would view it as a total banishment, and before the palace could clarify the nuances, the shockwaves were already radiating toward California. Charles believed he had established a precise boundary separating the household from the crown, but the moment the ruling crossed the Atlantic Ocean, that boundary dissolved beneath an immediate tidal wave of rage and sorrow. It required only a few brief minutes for the news to travel from Buckingham Palace to California, yet the psychological impact was immediate. Telephones vibrated constantly, and alerts flooded in from companions, legal counsel, reporters, and relatives alike. Inside the residence of Harry and Meghan, however, the most deafening sound was the total silence that followed. Two names had been struck from a lineage spanning hundreds of years, and all at once, every single hardship the couple had previously defended was being measured against what their offspring had lost, without ever being consulted. Refreshing the official monarchy website, Meghan watched the digital interface alter before her eyes. The names of Archie and Lilibet had vanished from the inheritance roll, the official registry detailing the legal sequence in which members of the royal household could claim the crown. That vacant line offered the very first tangible confirmation that the decree was no longer merely talk. Staring directly at the screen, she shut the laptop with force and remarked to Harry that the family had transformed their own bloodline into a conditional arrangement. Within minutes, Harry's strategists were on the phone, cautioning him that launching a public assault on the decree would only worsen the bitter dispute and render any future reconciliation virtually impossible. Yet remaining silent held its own perils. If he offered no response, the narrative spun by the palace would dictate his children's future, leading the global public to believe the exclusion had been conceded without any resistance. The Duke paid attention to their arguments, but every path presented to him felt entirely like a capitulation. Harry turned the blame upon himself, lamenting that his own relocation had gifted the monarchy the precise justification it required, leaving Archie and Lilibet to suffer the consequences of decisions they played no part in making. Meghan shut down that line of thinking immediately, reminding him that their departure was executed specifically to shield their little ones from intense scrutiny, public exposure, and an existence dictated by institutional expectations. Safeguarding their children should never have resulted in the revocation of their status within their own kin, she maintained, asserting that the king ought to have grasped that crucial distinction. Seated in total isolation, Charles received a brief text containing a solitary line, "They will remember exactly who authorized this verdict." The sovereign reviewed the words twice before placing his mobile device screen down on the surface. While he had fully anticipated a furious reaction from his son, this specific phrasing pierced his deepest anxiety that Archie and Lilibet would one day view their grandfather primarily through the lens of the decree that cast them out. Meanwhile, the Sussex public relations team had assembled an aggressive draft condemning the establishment for targeting innocent children with punitive measures. Harry examined the text but hesitated before granting his authorization, realizing that publishing such rhetoric would thrust his young children directly into the crosshairs of a global conflict, turning their identities into political weaponry long before they were mature enough to speak for themselves. His indignation cried out for retaliation, yet his protective instincts as a father commanded restraint. Before the communication could be broadcast, Catherine reached out. She had initiated contact with Harry entirely in private, bypassing palace protocols, and she offered no justification for the exclusion. Instead, the princess implored him not to permit the grown-ups to wield the children's names like battlefield ammunition. He came close to severing the connection, but a quality in her tone caused him to hesitate. As hostile statements were being drafted and animosity solidified on both sides, a single, calm conversation bypassed the entire apparatus of hostility, compelling Harry to look closely at what his family genuinely required from him. For the very first time since the onset of this emergency, no legal authorities were eavesdropping, no administrative aides were documenting the exchange, and no public statements were hanging in the balance for sign-off. There were simply two individuals conversing as relatives. Catherine had observed William enduring the intense pressure of the ruling, and she recognized that Harry was preparing to counter his own anguish with pure retaliation. Her call possessed no power to overturn the executive decision made by Charles, but it successfully shifted the focus away from how the Sussexes should retaliate, guiding it instead toward the emotional inheritance left to Archie and Lilibet. Catherine requested a mere 10 minutes of his time before he signed off on the aggressive press release prepared by his staff. That draft attacked the sovereign's verdict using unyielding rhetoric, alleging that the crown was exploiting two toddlers to resolve a dispute between adults. Harry consented with hesitation. She had almost never reached out to him directly throughout the unraveling of their family ties, and the reality that she chose to call entirely independent of William, palace monitors, or strategists signaled genuine empathy rather than political maneuvering. Harry maintained his defenses as the princess began to speak, warning him that Archie and Lilibet would inevitably look up their own identities online one day, only to unearth every single toxic allegation traded during this crisis. She pointed out that the youngsters would read through sensational headlines and malicious statements long after the grown-ups had forgotten the original resentment fueling them, asking if he truly desired their initial grasp of this historical moment to be colored by their father's rage. Harry countered that maintaining absolute silence would feel equivalent to deserting his offspring, stating he could not stand by while the monarchy wiped out their legal status and simultaneously dictated the historical narrative surrounding the event. Catherine validated his anxiety, yet countered that shielding his children did not necessitate binding them permanently to the very institutional warfare he had fought so hard to escape. The hierarchy of succession, that formal list dictating the inheritance of the throne, could undergo modifications without ever diminishing their intrinsic human value. The Duke's tone grew less rigid, admitting his greatest terror was that Archie would grow up believing he had been deprived of his birthright due to his father's actions. Though the princess sought to comfort him, the internal remorse persisted. Catherine assured him that Archie and Lilibet would be defined far more by the affection filling their household than by whatever rank their names occupied on a royal scroll, emphasizing that he still held the power to shape the psychological legacy his children would inherit. She then disclosed a detail William had passed along during a private household discussion. Charles had firmly dismissed an initiative to strip away every lingering title and had actively demanded that private family contact remain fully open. While this revelation did not eradicate Harry's resentment, it eroded his conviction that the sovereign desired total banishment. The king had established a strict perimeter, but he had stopped short of locking every entrance. Consequently, Harry recalled the hostile press release, authorizing in its place a highly disciplined reply, stating that the dignity, core identity, and future prospects of Archie and Lilibet would never be dictated by institutional rank. His resolution fundamentally altered the climate, yet it possessed no power to quiet the wave of public judgment mounting outside the palace parameters. Harry had made the deliberate choice not to counter the crown with unrestrained hostility, thereby leaving the citizenry to determine whether Charles had successfully insulated the crown or unfeelingly harmed two blameless infants in the process. By the arrival of morning, the crisis had expanded far beyond the boundaries of the royal family, dominating television broadcasts, train stations, news kiosks, and spontaneous debates outside the palace entryways. Certain observers perceived a monarch establishing much-needed administrative transparency, while others witnessed a grandfather permitting legal obligations to crush two helpless children. Nonetheless, a solitary visual element encapsulated the dispute more vividly than any commentary panel. The official lineage directory, visibly truncated, with the spaces for Archie and Lilibet completely vacant. Television networks disrupted scheduled broadcasts as royal biographers contrasted this emergency with historical chapters where private domestic strife had fundamentally reshaped the crown itself. The legal framework of inheritance was no longer analyzed as some abstract statute. It had transformed into an intense public dispute over obligation, kinship, and whether offspring ought to shoulder the fallout of choices made by their parents. Proponents of Charles argued that a place in the succession demanded an active, physical link to the United Kingdom, whereas detractors pointed out that Archie and Lilibet had never volunteered to live apart from the monarchy. A prominent London publication summarized the widespread indignation using a mere 3 words splashed across its front page: "The names erased." Photographs of Archie and Lilibet from their infancy were displayed beneath the bold lettering, while a significantly smaller snapshot depicted Charles executing the official decree. The visual juxtaposition was unforgiving. One portrait captured absolute state authority, while the others displayed 2 children far too young to grasp why their inherited position in world history had been obliterated. Near the entrances of Buckingham Palace, a modest gathering formed along the perimeter. A woman stepped forward to slide 2 white flowers through the iron railings, remarking to a reporter during a recorded street segment that while the children might remain oblivious today, a time would surely come when they would comprehend everything. Her perspective resonated rapidly because it articulated an emotional truth that constitutional authorities completely overlooked. A decree might successfully fortify an establishment, yet its psychological toll would ultimately be paid by the actual human beings listed on the document. Charles observed the media broadcasts in total stillness. A commentator characterized the decree as the most isolated resolution of his entire sovereignty, and Camilla observed him cast his gaze downward the moment the portraits of Archie and Lilibet dominated the broadcast screen. The Queen Consort asserted that an official palace explanatory note needed to be published immediately. Though he concurred, the sovereign recognized that no amount of meticulously drafted prose could dissolve the visual impression already branded into the collective consciousness of the public. Meanwhile, William encountered this public resentment firsthand during a scheduled state appearance. An individual within the gathering shouted out, demanding to know if Archie and Lilibet were still considered part of the household. The prince hesitated momentarily before offering his reply: "They will always be family." His spontaneous answer spread with far greater velocity than any prepared press release from the palace communications team, precisely because it resonated with human warmth rather than bureaucratic coldness. Shortly thereafter, the palace issued a formal clarification confirming that the decree related strictly to institutional standing and did not dissolve the children's private relationships with their royal kin. The collective anger gradually dissolved into somber contemplation, leaving one ultimate dilemma: what internal significance would the household assign to this deep scar? The public square had passed its sentence through headlines and commentary, but the ultimate significance of this ruling would be decided in absolute privacy by the relatives bound to endure its reality. When all was said and done, Archie and Lilibet had surrendered a position in the line of inheritance, yet they remained in full possession of their names, their household, and the freedom to forge an identity completely independent of the monarchy. The executive decree issued by Charles terminated an institutional trajectory with absolute, unyielding clarity, while simultaneously exposing a painful reality the crown had spent decades trying to ignore. Royal birthright could no longer persist, entirely detached from royal accountability. While the judgment itself was historic, its profoundest core was deeply human rather than technical. Once Charles finalized the administrative legal procedures, the palace verified the final result without any hesitation. Archie and Lilibet were officially expunged from the sequence of succession, the authorized legal framework determining the next occupant of the British throne. Their status would not be reinstated through periods of quiet, administrative foot-dragging, or behind-the-scenes bargaining. The establishment presented this transformation as an unalterable alignment between inheritance and state service, a path demanding rigorous preparation, permanent domestic residency, and an engaged dynamic with the British government. It was explicitly not framed as a critique of the children's personal worth, yet the king was fully aware that statutory justifications could never heal an intimate psychological scar. Consequently, Charles composed a confidential letter addressed to both of his grandchildren. Within its lines, the sovereign explained that his crown had extorted a specific institutional verdict, whereas his role as their grandfather stood as an independent, inviolable vow. He refrained from pleading for absolution, requesting only that Archie and Lilibet review his words once they had reached an age to determine for themselves what kind of connection they wished to cultivate with him. The correspondence contained no public justifications, for he understood that affection validated through the lens of public relations would carry no real substance. Upon receiving the envelope, Harry declined to distribute its contents, opting instead to lock it securely inside a private drawer. He remarked to Meghan that their offspring ought to determine entirely on their own terms whether they ever desired to unseal it. She voiced her agreement, recognizing that this specific choice ultimately belonged to Archie and Lilibet themselves, rather than to crown strategists, protective parents, or sensationalist news headings. Sometime later, Archie inquired as to why so many individuals had been placing telephone calls to their home. Kneeling down to meet his son's gaze, Harry explained that the grown-ups were simply debating chapters of royal history, emphasizing that absolutely nothing had changed regarding his true identity or the immense depth of the love surrounding him. The Duke's explanation possessed no power to reinstate a lost institutional rank. Even so, it provided his son with an asset the crown could never offer: unconditional certainty. Following the public broadcast, William met with Charles in private, noting that while the decree might effectively safeguard the structural integrity of the monarchy, true family reconciliation would demand a path far wider than the one they had just forced closed.